Good morning. Welcome to Focus on the News. I'm Senator Black, retired senator. And today we've got a very special guest, good dear friend of mine, Janice Courtcamp. Jan is one of a handful of very heroic people who took a stand regarding the war in Syria. Now, the war in Syria was one of a great many wars that the Central Intelligence Agency planned and initiated throughout the Middle East. And CIA agents actually landed in Syria to coordinate with Al-Qaeda terrorists and to set up supply lines even before there was a war. And there were a number of people. Interestingly, there were a number of very heroic women, and Jan was one of them. We also had Eva Bartlett. We had Vanessa Beeley. Later, as time went on, Tulsi Gabbard went. And these are people who actually went into the country, just as I did. And they actually were on the ground. And probably no one, well, I can't say that, but I would just say that Janice Courtcamp spent an enormous amount of time on the ground in Syria, traveling all over, disclosing what was going on, the duplicity of the United States in supporting the very same terrorist group that flew the jets into the Twin Towers on 9/11. And we have consistently supported them ever since. And we're going to talk about the very cruel, vengeful nature of the State Department's position regarding the earthquake victims in Syria. So with that, I think I'd like to just perhaps let Jan comment a few minutes. She and I have worked very closely to try to support the people who are fighting against ISIS and Al-Qaeda and all of these venomous elements that almost overthrew the government in Damascus at one time. So Jan, welcome to you with that long introduction. Why don't you just make, just let you take it from there.
Well, thank you so much for having me on today, Senator. And, I would like to just tell your audience that I do not work for anyone. I have no affiliations. I accept no money or anything like that for anything that I've done in Syria. My husband and I paid for my first 3 trips, and then we had to use crowdfunding for the next 4 because we just couldn't afford it anymore. But I went into Syria simply because I had become obsessed with this situation. I had studied it since the end of 2012, after the terrible destruction of Libya and the horrific torture and murder of Colonel Gaddafi. I felt that I needed to learn more about what was going on in the region at that time. And Syria, of course, was slated to be next for the, so-called freedom and democracy. And I began studying it and very quickly became completely obsessed, spending all day, every day since then, literally studying not just the conflict and the politics of what was going on, but Syria as a country itself and the people and the industries and the education system, healthcare, as much as I could, the cuisine, everything, because I really became pretty emotionally, very emotionally attached to that country and those people. And I realized that in order for me to be a credible voice in this discussion, I had to go and see it for myself, and which I've done on 7 extended trips since 2016 through the end of 2019. I've been around much of the country, and most of, my main goal has always been to just spend as much time with people in Syria as I could from as many different backgrounds and opinions as possible. So just to give your audience an overview of what I've been trying to do there. Um, as you described it so well, we are dealing with a manufactured war. This started back in 2004 after Syria refused to basically submit to U.S. dictates regarding helping them in Iraq, ending their close relationship with Iran and the resistance movements against Israeli expansionism. And after they refused those dictates, overnight, Syria became, part of this axis of evil kind of mentality. And sanctions started. The U.S. started funding and supporting and training, so-called opposition activists and journalists. Eventually led to, as you said, running weapons into extremist groups in Syria, many of those from, I guess, Gaddafi's arsenal after the fall of Libya. And so I try to, it's a very complicated situation, but I summarize it as a U.S.-led terrorist proxy war against Syria, which has never been any threat, nor ever threatened, nor ever wanted anything but positive, mutually beneficial relations with the U.S. And it just staggered me. It blew my mind that the U.S. was engaging in this subversive, really horrific aggression against this country that really, no country deserves what happened in Syria, but certainly Syria least of all, in my opinion.
Yes. Well, let me give a little background and update to where we are as of today, because what has gotten our attention is the fact that this earthquake has hit, and it has hit Turkey and Syria. And while there's most of the attention is paid to Turkey, it's hard to say. A tremendous amount of the death toll is in Syria. It's probably not the majority, but it's significant. At a point where they were talking about 5,000 dead, 2,000 were being reported as dead in Syria. So my guess is that it may be like 40% of the death toll, but I'm not sure of that. No one is. But what happened is the world sort of react, and they began pouring assistance into Turkey, which certainly was appropriate. And but the tremendous amount of death has occurred in the city of Aleppo. Aleppo is the second largest city in Syria after Damascus. And it's sort of in the area of the Turkish border. It's not terribly far from it. And so what's happening is that as the earthquake has occurred and people are forced out of their homes, many times their homes are simply collapsed rubble, the temperatures are dropping, it's freezing cold. In some places there's rain, cold rain, and the Catholic bishop, Audio of Aleppo, the big city of Aleppo, told the Vatican that he'd never seen such destruction in war-torn Syria. Now that's saying a lot, because the war caused immense destruction. And he says there's fear now that the people are in the street, in the cold, under the rain. He says there's damage everywhere, even in the cathedral. Now, it might surprise you to hear about a cathedral in Syria, but the U.S. State Department made it a policy that they would not reveal the fact that a substantial portion of the Syrian population are Christians. So you may never have heard about the Christians in Syria, but they have. I had once heard, and I can't verify this, but it does make sense. I had heard that Syria was actually the first fully Christianized nation on earth. And the reason is that the Sea of Galilee, where Jesus did much of his ministry, is only an 80-mile walk to Damascus. So you take about 4 days hard walk and you've arrived in Damascus. So after Pentecostal, when the apostles were told to go forth and preach the gospel to all the nations, what are you going to do if you're a poor guy with a pair of sandals and a sack of dried fish? Well, maybe you can catch a boat, and, do what St. Paul did later on. But maybe you just start walking, and that happened in many places. And the first place you can reach is Syria. So Syria was a very heavily Christianized country. It was occupied by the Crusaders for a couple hundred years. And so in any event, now with all of this terrible destruction, everybody is quite aware of it. The State Department, it is hard for normal human beings to understand the decadence, the cruelty, and the utter evil that infests the United States State Department. This is not the America we grew up in. This is a department that is infested with a level of hideousness that is just, if Americans knew about it, I don't think the government could survive if they really understood the things that go on there. But this is the official statement about the suffering and the agony of the people in Syria. And this was put out by Ned Price, a spokesman at the State Department. And he said, "I will make the point that it would be quite ironic, if not counterproductive, for us to reach out to a government that has brutalized its people over the course of a dozen years, now gassing them, slaughtering them, being responsible for much of the suffering they've endured." Well, we won't go deeply into this, but I can tell you that there would never have been a war in Syria without the Central Intelligence Agency, without the explicit approval of Barack Obama, without the Operation Timber Sycamore, by which the Central Intelligence Agency routed looted arms from Syria across the border to Al-Qaeda, and even indirectly to ISIS, and waged a campaign of massive. This wasn't a matter of massive rape that occurred incidental to war, where you just have a breakdown of order. There was a policy, and I'm not saying that the State Department initiated the policy, but they never interfered with the policy followed by ISIS and Al-Qaeda to massively rape women in the country of Syria, to the point where there were so many children of rape that they had to change the law of citizenship so that the citizenship of children of rape would be the mother rather than the father, who was someone sent by the Central Intelligence Agency from Tunisia or from Algeria or Saudi Arabia or whatever. So for Ned Price of the State Department to get up and to give this spiteful, vengeful, hate-filled diatribe that just completely ignores the suffering of people who are literally, there was, and I'm not sure whether it was Turkey or whether it was Syria, but there was a child rescued who still had the placenta attached, and his mother had died, and somehow he had survived. This is the situation. And meanwhile, these arrogant State Department people with their shiny shoes and their diamond rings and their, and their orgies and all the garbage they have going on in the State Department, and they sit there and they sneer down their noses at good, decent, honest people in Syria. I, I obviously have a low regard for them.
Well, we're about the latest death toll is about 2,600 people in Syria known dead so far. Most of those in Aleppo, of course, as you said, also Latakia, many of the areas around the zone there. Um, it's important for people to understand the state of the Syrian people right now after 12 years of war. Um, and, the sanctions actually started back in 2004, but they were increased under the Caesar Act to be true collective punishment against the entire population. And so before the war, for example, the middle class was the largest economic sector and the fastest growing economic sector. The middle class has been utterly gutted. It does not exist anymore. So you have a few very wealthy people, and then you have 90% under the poverty line. People are in dire straits. The economy has been absolutely shredded. On top of that, the fuel situation is horrific. Many people, even before the earthquake, were only having an hour of electricity a day. As you said, it is cold there. Gas, fuel for oil, for heating, for cooking, and of course, fuel for vehicles is exceedingly difficult to get. They are having trouble in Aleppo getting fuel for the ambulances, trying
Jen,
to
maybe,
deal with the
Jen,
situation.
maybe you could explain. Syria has traditionally been self-dependent in oil and gas, and
Yes.
in fact, to the point where they were able to export certain amount. No, it was never a big oil producer, but it was certainly self-sufficient and actually brought some money. What happened to this oil?
Well, the U.S. actually maintains an illegal occupation of nearly 1/3 of Syria's lands. And these are the lands that, not coincidentally, hold their richest oil fields as well as their wheat and other grain fields. This is the area to the northeast, basically on the Iraqi side of the Euphrates River. And so the US, with their mercenary army that they are creating there, have been just stealing Syria's oil. About 80 to 82% of Syria's oil is getting pirated by the United States of America. And very few Americans even know this is going on. So literally the US and all of its allies have been laying siege against Syria and starving it economically and starving it with from energy. And now, that has created this absolute catastrophe. They're unable to deal with this horrific earthquake situation because things were just so difficult before that. As you said, this is vindictive policy. This is clearly designed to make the Syrian people suffer as greatly as possible. And they're very tired. They're they're absolutely, they're beyond weary of all of this. And all that needs to happen for major changes to happen very quickly is for the U.S. to drop these sanctions and end their illegal occupation and the theft of their oil. And they just refuse to do it.
Well, John, the northern Syria was the breadbasket of the entire country. They produced enough wheat, an abundance of wheat to feed the entire nation and to export. They got significant income from exporting wheat. Now, what has happened to that wheat?
The same as with the oil, isn't it? The U.S. has absconded with it. Literally, we're playing pirates in Syria, and the American people, because of our corrupt and criminally bad media, are not even aware of it. this is what's astonishing is U.S. officials will boast about us controlling a third of Syria, taking their oil, and nobody seems to care. The media certainly doesn't care.
Isn't it ironic how we have whipped people into a hysteria over the fact that Russia has crossed Ukraine's sovereign borders and what an outrage this is. Can you think of any place where the United States has crossed another nation's sovereign borders?
I'd like to know of a country that we haven't done that with. And this is going back to the earthquake relief. And what Ned Price said, this is a very important point that the U.S. is only intending to help people in Idlib. Now, the U.S. former envoy to Syria.
And who can you explain who the people are in Idlib?
Sure, yeah. The former envoy himself described Idlib as the largest stronghold of Al Qaeda in the world. Even Foreign Policy magazine admitted it has become the global capital of terrorism. What had happened was back in 2015, the Army of Conquest, dominated by the Al Qaeda affiliate Al Nusra, moved into the area, displaced the people who were living there for the most part, massacred often minorities, religious minorities,
Christians,
Alawites, traditional Shiites, and basically took over that region. In addition, as areas of Syria were getting liberated, there was something called the reconciliation. And fighters that had fought against the government were allowed to get on the green buses and move with their families to Idlib. So Idlib is basically, they were just trying to clear out as much of Syria as they could from these terrorist proxy armies. So they were moving, they got them all kind of concentrated in Idlib, where they've been protected by the US and its allies ever since, literally forbidding Syria and Russia from, making that final victory over these terrorist groups in its own country. So Idlib is, now there are many civilians. I'm not saying everybody who lives in Idlib is a terrorist, but the leaders there are terrorists. And they did such things as that poor Armenian woman who decided to stay and help people as much as she could. And they grabbed her and they raped her for 9 hours before cutting her head off. These are the rebels and are, the people that are being supported by the United States of America. And these are the people that will get earthquake disaster relief. Now, one thing I can tell you as someone who's been around Syria and been in areas that were liberated by these from these so-called rebel groups, is that what they will do is they will hoard that aid. The aid will only go to people who are fighting for them, who are fighters for them, or families of fighters. Anyone else will be forced, if it's even made available to them, will be forced to pay exorbitant prices. They've done this everywhere they've gone. And so that aid is just another way for these terrorist groups to actually earn extra money by charging people who have the sad misfortune of living under them exorbitant prices.
Let me just read something that was issued by the Middle East Council of Churches. Now, these are Christian churches, and the Middle East Council of Churches represents the Orthodox Christians, the Evangelical Christians, and the Catholic Christian churches. And they issued a statement calling for the international community to provide emergency aid and to lift sanctions on Syria so that, and this is a quote, so sanctions may not turn into a crime against humanity. Now, who are they focused on when they talk about the sanctions?
Yeah, go ahead.
These are the Caesar sanctions, aren't they?
Yes, yes, of course. And, most Americans hear the word sanctions and they think this is some kind of gentle, peaceful way of pressuring governments to, be better, get democracy and human rights and freedom. They are, even by the admission of the people who created the sanctions, that is not what they're for. They're literally for applying so much pressure on the people, making them so miserable and desperate that they will rise up against their government and perform the hope for regime change, the DC warmongers want. But they don't even work that way. All that happens is that people get more and more miserable, they suffer more. Many people die. 500,000 children died in Iraq by US sanctions. And Madeleine Albright just, oh, it was worth it. We think it was worth it. And so this is the mentality in Washington. Sanctions are truly economic terrorism against entire populations. And this is what
Jan, let
sanctions.
me interrupt. I have someone who has written in, and he says, and I can't read the hieroglyphics from his name, but it says, Senator Black, why don't you donate? How come you complain, but I don't see you open your wallet to help Syrian victims? Hypocrisy? Can you explain why we are not
I would love to explain
contributing?
Why. I just tried to contribute. I did contribute. A friend of mine who's a Syrian Christian was organizing a fundraiser to help families in Aleppo, and GoFundMe seized all of the funds and has suspended the campaign. This is what sanctions do to whomever wrote into you. Neither of us can send money into Syria to help people. Now, our government can send money into HTS, al-Nusra, al-Qaeda in Idlib all day long. But you and I are not allowed to send help into Syria. Now, we are starting to see the Antiochian Diocese of North America has opened up a fundraiser for Turkey and Syria, and they will be able to get help to people Aleppo. I'm not, and Latakia and other areas, but I'm not sure how much of the money raised will actually get into Syria versus going into Turkey, for example. Antioch was devastated. Antioch is nearly destroyed. So, some of the churches are able to get some funds in there, but it gets very watered down, and any personal initiatives are immediately shut down, and you can actually end up in prison for violating sanctions in this way. So, to answer your person's question, take it up with Ned Price, buddy, at the State Department as to why we can't do that.
Well, and just to inform it, because this may have been a very, very well-meaning comment, these sanctions are draconian. They criminalize the actions of people who would like to help. I want to quote you a specific line from the Caesar Act, which was just one of the most draconian things our Congress has ever done. And it says, this is a quote, and this is from the State Department website, quote, the Caesar Act also mandates sanctions on those profiting off the Syrian conflict by engaging in reconstruction activities. Now, the purpose of that is to prohibit any rebuilding of all of the war-torn areas, the devastated places. And you and I have both walked through the cities with piles of rubble, blown down buildings and so forth. And the Caesar Act is designed to block the Syrian people from being able to rebuild, to build homes. So they're forced to just live in these piles of rubble in little cubby holes, maybe with a piece of plastic over the doorway, so that they can get out of the wind. But no, Americans cannot donate money to Syria. It's not permitted. And here's another question. This has just come up. And I'll let you answer this, Jan. It says, is Russia helping to provide aid regardless of sanctions?
Oh, yes, of course. Russian troops are already there and rescue workers. They're donating huge amounts of humanitarian aid to the people and distributing it. And this is what they've done throughout the course of the war since they entered in 2015. For example, in Aleppo, when Aleppo was finally freed in December of 2016 from the various terrorist groups that had made life a living hell in that city for years. The Russians were there, just doctors caring for people, handing out the food, making sure they had fuel, heating fuel, cooking oil, that kind of thing. So they're actually very accustomed to doing this, and they're ramping up those efforts. Many other countries also, Iran, of course, Algeria, China, many countries are stepping up, but no, not one single Western country.
Not one day to a country
Of
where
course.
they're all under the dominance of the U.S. I want to give people just one idea of just a little snapshot of the people that the United States supported. And this is out of an article that was published in 2016 in the Times of Israel. And the headline was, "Video shows Palestinian boy beheaded by US-backed Syrian rebels." Now, this is published in Israel. This isn't some conservative blog. Palestinian boy beheaded by US-backed Syrian rebels. And this was a story about a sick little boy. He was very small. He would, he'd come up to here on me. And
Yeah, Abdullah Isa.
and you remember he had this terrible blood disease that afflicts people in the Middle East. He was actually receiving transfusions when 5 people who were paid, whose salaries were paid by the United States, kidnapped him from a hospital in Aleppo. He still had the IV hanging in his arm. They took him in a pickup truck and they drove him to the center of the rebel-held part of Aleppo, and they didn't have one of those big swords or something that they usually use to behead people. So they held this little boy. I mean, this is a child. Anybody who saw him immediately would say, "This is a little child and he's sick." You can tell from the pallor in his face. He was sick. And since they didn't have a big cleaver or an axe, they're all laughing. And these are 5 fairly young guys, and they literally sawed his head off. They had to saw back and forth, and then it took them a while. And here's this, you can imagine what this child was going through. And then they held his head up and they showed it to the crowd, because what they were trying to do, they were trying to intimidate the civilians in that part of Aleppo so that they wouldn't escape over to the government side. And the U.S. State Department made a statement, and they said, well, we might reconsider funding for the group if it turns out to be accurate. It's a video, and it was very explicit. So this is just one example, and there are a multitude that go on and on.
Yes, that's the Noor al-Din al-Zanki group in Aleppo, and they had received direct U.S. support, as you mentioned, in terms of funds, also advanced U.S. weapons, like anti-tank missile systems and things of that nature. So they were one of the big, so-called moderate rebel groups that were directly backed by the U.S. government. And this is all under the war on terror hoax, I call it, because this is what they were really up to. And when Aleppo was liberated from those groups, I'm sure you remember, what was the very first thing the people of Aleppo did at the end of December 2016 when their city was liberated? Do you remember? They
I,
held
I remember there was ecstasy in the streets. That's all I can remember.
What they did was they held a huge Christmas celebration.
Yes. Hmm. Yeah,
And
because now they were free to practice Christianity, um,
yeah,
and,
and
and and not just Christians, but because of the, well, you why don't you just explain the unique uh, sort of religious interaction in Syria?
absolutely, Syria is described as a living tapestry. So you have about 24 religions, you have many ethnic groups and that sort of thing. And it's very typical for your Muslim friend to go with you to Christmas Mass and you to join in with their family during Ramadan and this sort of thing. This was the way of that most of Syria was, and what most Syrians want is this. It's not just a secular society, it is not anti religion, it is respectful of all religions. And, many times I've had descriptions of people, Muslim friends who would go into the Jewish quarter on Saturday and help out the Jewish moms there doing little chores for them on Saturday and getting cookies in return. And, of course, the Christians going to the weddings of Muslim friends, etc. This was common. And if we have a moment here, I'd like to read from an article from 2014 that you're probably familiar with. And it was in Catholic World Report. It's called ISIS, Assad, and What the West is Missing About Syria.
Okay, we've got just a couple minutes if you'd like to do that.
I think it's well worth it. This Monsignor Giuseppe Nazaro, who was the apostolic visitor to Aleppo, described Syria before the U.S. decided to bring it freedom and democracy using Al Qaeda. Described Syria this way: Assad opened the country up to foreign trade, to tourism within the country and from abroad, to freedom of movement and of education for both men and women. Before the protests started, the number of women in the professional world had been constantly increasing. The university was open to all, and there was no discrimination on the basis of sex. The country was at peace, prosperity was on the rise, and human rights were respected. A common home and fatherland to many ethnicities and 23 different religious groups. Syria has always been a place where all were free to believe and live out their creed. All relationships were characterized by mutual respect. The freedom that is purportedly being brought to us by the rebels is precisely what this rebellion has taken away from us.
Well, that's an excellent comment, and we certainly appreciate you being with us. I know that there's a growing anti-war demonstration that is about to take place. We'll probably have details on it on Monday, and we'll try to announce that. But again, this is Jan Kortkamp, one of the great heroes of freedom and liberty in the world. And we live in a world of deceit, and the masters of deceit inspire hatred in the American people towards the best people, and then they inspire love towards the worst elements. And it's a shame because, I've shed a bucket of blood for this country. My radio men died right beside me fighting for this country. And Jan, we're just so pleased that you're still in the fight, and we're pleased that you managed to spend a lot of time in Syria and a lot of very dangerous places, and that God's looked after you and taken care of you. So anyway, we're going to sign off at this point. But Jan, thank you for being with us. We will see all of you again at 11 a.m. on Monday morning. It's been Focus on the News. Thank you.